Kia ora koutou, my name is Joe Lane. I'm an atmospheric chemist and the Deputy Dean here at Te Ako Mātuatua School of Science at the University of Waikato. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate change and our brand new Bachelor of Climate Change degree. So at the heart of climate change is the greenhouse effect. Sunshine comes down to the Earth and is absorbed by the Earth. Now some of that energy gets re-irradiated back into space as heat. And that heat is able to be absorbed by some of the molecules that are present in Earth's atmosphere. We call these molecules so-called greenhouse gases. And these are things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. Now, over the past 150 years or so, the concentration of these greenhouse gases has significantly increased in Earth's atmosphere. This is mostly due to the combustion of fossil fuels to produce electricity, to drive our cars, to produce different products and so forth. And so as the concentration of those greenhouse gases has increased, so too has the temperature of the Earth, because more energy is being trapped and held into the atmosphere. Now, a lot of you will have a pretty simple idea of climate change in your mind like this, and I want to convince you firstly today that climate change is so much more than just global warming. Firstly, when we think about global warming, the word global implies that we have an equal effect that is occurring everywhere around the Earth, and that everybody's kind of contributing to the problem globally as well. And that's really not the case. We know that some parts of the world are experiencing warming that's up to twice as fast as other parts of the world, particularly in like the Arctic region. And we also know that in parts of, say, our Pacific Island neighbours, some of those regions where they're very low-lying countries, that they're going to experience the effects of climate change much more readily than other parts of the world that live in higher altitudes. And so this raises some interesting and important social justice questions about emissions that are coming from countries that are relatively low, but they're going to experience a disproportionate effect from climate change. Now, with climate change, as the temperature of the Earth increases, the rate of evaporation for water into the atmosphere increases as well. So this means that our atmosphere holds on to more water. And you may have heard of the old adage of what goes up must come down. And that's certainly true when we think of weather as well. So as more water enters into the atmosphere, that means there is more water available to fall down to the atmosphere. And so as the climate changes, as the temperature increases, we expect to see more extreme weather events and more frequent extreme weather events. Now that has a knock-on effect into our entire financial sector. Things like insurance are fundamentally about taking a bet as to whether a certain activity is going to take place. And so as we have increased extreme weather events, our insurance premiums are going to rise. And that has a cascading effect into mortgages and lending and our entire financial sector. Climate change is also significantly affecting our ability to produce food. From regions of the world where they're receiving too much rain, and that's causing flooding and other damage and challenges for crops and for animals, we also have regions of the world that will be experiencing extreme dry conditions because the changing weather patterns means that less rainfall is going to fall in those spaces. Some key crops, things like cherries, require a certain number of frost days for fruiting to be really bountiful. And so as the climate changes, different crops are going to be able to be grown into different regions. The increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere also means that there will be more carbon dioxide that is driven into and absorbed by the oceans. Now, as the oceans absorb carbon dioxide, it causes them to become more acidified, the pH lowers, and this is really challenging for small marine organisms, things like plankton and also larval stages of shellfish and other species, causing a knock-on effect through our entire marine ecosystem, threatening our aquaculture and our fisheries industries. So from this quick description, you might be starting to get an impression that climate change is really complex, and that's certainly true. It affects all of the different facets of the world around us. But the solution to climate change is incredibly simple. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. There is no other option. When people talk to you about different approaches to battling climate change, what they are talking about are either band-aid solutions, where we attempt to deal with the symptom rather than the underlying cause, or attempts to somehow have our cake and eat it too, or some sort of irrational discounting of the future, pretending that the current situation is actually quite fine. But it's really not. There's this quote from Elon Musk back from 2013 that I really think beautifully summarizes the situation. So Musk says, well, we're running the most dangerous experiment in history right now, which is to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before there is an environmental catastrophe. And you might be thinking, well, hey, this is Elon Musk. He's the CEO of Tesla. He's trying to convince people to buy more electric vehicles so that he can make more money. This is just some sort of environmental grandstanding. But it's really not. And I think one figure does a great job of trying to explain just how varied and how changed our current climate really is. This is a plot that shows the concentration of carbon dioxide that's been in Earth's atmosphere over the past 800,000 years or so. This is data that has been collected from an ice core in Antarctica, about 3.1 kilometers worth of ice, where there are tiny air bubbles that are captured and trapped, and within those we can look at the composition of the air. What we see is that the concentration of CO2 in Earth's atmosphere has gone up and down, up and down, up and down, from about 180 parts per million to, say, 280 parts per million. So up and down, up and down. Now, this natural process is a very well-known phenomena. And if you think back to the greenhouse effect that I talked about at the beginning of this little session, this is because the Earth doesn't quite go around the sun in a perfect circle. There are times where we get a little bit closer to the sun and a little bit further away from the sun, which causes the temperature of the Earth to increase a little bit and to decrease a little bit. And this is principally what we see in this data. When the Earth gets a little bit warmer, the oceans warm up and they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we see a spike in CO2. And when the Earth gets a little bit colder, the CO2 then gets reabsorbed back into the oceans. Now, this happens over a very long time period, hundreds of thousands of years, but we have this up and down cycle. And when you look across close to the present day, you can see that the concentration of CO2 was going up and up and up. And then if you look at this previous pattern, you might reasonably expect it to start to drop back down again. Okay, and that is what should be happening right now. We are getting a little bit further away from the sun on average, and so the Earth should be getting a little bit cooler, and so the concentration of CO2 should be decreasing. But it's not. We have managed to massively overcome that natural cycle such that the concentration of CO2 is over 408 parts per million now, well over the value that it has ever been in the last 800,000 years or so. So we clearly have a problem. Now, I said to you that the solution to climate change was simple, and that's certainly true. But we shouldn't confuse something that is simple with something that is easy to do. And this is fundamentally why I believe that we haven't seen large change in society's behavior to combat or address concerns around climate change. Now, you might be starting to despair, and you might be starting to think, well, what on earth can I do? This problem looks pretty big. We keep seeing IPCC reports coming out telling us that the climate is getting warmer and warmer and that we have less and less time to do something. So what can you do? I want to suggest there are three things that you can do as an individual. Firstly, develop your own understanding of climate change science. The science isn't actually particularly complicated in terms of understanding the general effects of climate change and global warming. So get a good understanding of climate change science. And then with that good understanding of climate change science, you can start to make good personal choices to reduce your own emissions, right? Opt for the low carbon option when you're purchasing a product or choosing to travel or choosing to move around the world. The third thing you can do is to expand your circle of influence. So it's not just about changes that you can make for your personal emissions, but that you can join the workforce of tomorrow as a climate-informed employee, and you can start advocating and making decisions for your organization that you work in and how they can choose to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to prepare you for the workforce of the tomorrow, we have created our brand new Bachelor of Climate Change degree. And this is what we believe is the next step in what is necessary to see real change in society to take up the challenge that climate change presents for us. So this Bachelor of Climate Change, it's a world first. It is only available here at the University of Waikato. And what it does, crucially, is it allows you to study to become an expert in a wide range of different subjects that are necessary as we attempt to develop solutions to climate change. So you'll become an expert in one of a range of different specific existing subjects that are relevant and necessary for climate change. You will also develop a very broad understanding of climate change across its different scientific, social, cultural, and economic dimensions. Lastly, the Bachelor of Climate Change degree, from a design point of view, incorporates Mātauranga Māori throughout the degree structure, and you will learn how people exist as a part of the natural world and not separated from it. There is a fantastic Māori whakatauki, he oranga taio, he oranga tangata, which in short says, when our environment is well, it is healthy, that is also a scenario that people will be well, people will be healthy. So the Bachelor of Climate Change degree is like any bachelor's program here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a 3-year program, and here at the University of Waikato you will take 8 different courses in each of those 3 years of the degree, and those are represented by the 24 white boxes that are in front of you. Now, through the core of the degree are these grey papers, and this is where you will develop that really broad and holistic understanding of what climate change is. You will learn about the scientific aspects, you'll learn about how arts and activism is related, you will discover how climate change impacts and affects Māori and Indigenous peoples to a disproportionate effect in many cases. You'll understand how the climate is going to change and how we can adapt to some of those impacts. And then lastly, you'll learn in terms of how we can try to address climate change, what mitigation strategies are in place. You can then select one of, as I said, a wide range of different majors. These are represented by the yellow boxes that you can see here on the screen. And this is the selection of majors that are available for our Bachelor of Climate Change. Now, these are there are some majors that you would expect, things like ecology and earth science, but there are also things like economics. There's philosophy, there's public relations, sociology, strategic management. And this is because we need people throughout the workforce in many different sectors of society who are both fantastic economists, but they also understand climate change, or they're fantastic in political science, but they also understand climate change. Lastly, with the degree, you have 7 elective slots where you can choose papers from across the entire university. So this really allows you to shape your degree to really suit your career aspirations. Now, to finish up with your degree in Climate 301, this is the last of the compulsory papers for the degree, you'll get the opportunity to work with an external organisation. You will go out in groups, multidisciplinary groups of 5 or 6 students, and what you will do is an assessment of that organisation's emissions, and you will try to develop a low carbon strategy for them to consider implementing. This will really give you the skills and experiences that are going to be necessary as we try to work together towards a target of net zero emissions here in Aotearoa by 2050. Now, to conclude this little session, I want to talk to you about some of the unique challenges we have here in Aotearoa. You might be tempted to think that, hey, climate change is a global problem, and so maybe people in other countries can do something about it. But what's really important to realize is that Aotearoa's greenhouse gas emissions are very different than other parts of the world. This figure over to the left shows you the breakdown of our emissions into different sectors, and then you can see that almost 50% of our emissions come from the agricultural sector. When you look at other countries, this percentage is typically around 15 to 20%, which shows us that agriculture is something that we really need to think about how we do smarter here in Aotearoa. And this is principally because we produce a lot more food than we consume as a nation. And so we need to not cut our food production, right? This is not saying we need to massively slash and reduce what we're doing in the agricultural sector, but rather we need to look for smarter solutions. We need to try and produce beef or milk or whatever we might be trying to do as efficiently as possible in terms of our emissions. The second thing is in terms of our electricity generation. So here in Aotearoa, most of our electricity, around 96% of it, comes from renewable energy sources already. Other parts of the world, they might only be operating at 10, 15, 20% of renewable energy. And so when you look at a strategy for another country, they might say, hey, we're going to shut down all of our coal-fired power plants. We're going to replace those with renewable energy sources. And that's a really viable strategy for those countries to consider reducing their emissions. But here in Aotearoa, we don't have that much capacity that is fossil fuel driven at the moment to be able to cut. So that's not going to be an effective strategy for us. However, one thing that is unique for us is the very high proportion of our emissions that come from the transportation sector. So you might have wondered why the government is focused on a move to increasing the proportion of electric vehicles here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that's because about 20% of our emissions come from the transport sector, and of those, about 3/4 come from passenger vehicles driving around our nation's roads. So this is an area where we've got an existing technology solution. We do have electric vehicles. The question really is around their affordability and our ability to change the infrastructure here in Aotearoa so that we can effectively charge them at different spots around the country. So we have a technology solution, but the issue we have is an economic and a social one as to how we might roll out and use electric vehicles to a much greater extent. Okay, so that's it. If you want to find out more about the Bachelor of Climate Change, to consider studying it here in 2022, feel free to scan this QR code or go to waikato.ac.nz/go/climate. And I would encourage you to take up the challenge of addressing our emissions. That this is something that is within our hands. It takes individual action, and it takes students choosing to take up their place in the workforce as a climate change informed employee. So that's it. That's all I've got to say today. Thank you very much for watching this session, and I would love to see you here at the University of Waikato next year.